and welcome to our Women in Horror panel as part of the Dark Hedges Film Festival. I'm your host, Colette Fahy, and we have two amazing guests here with us this year. We have Giuliana Monteverde and Victoria McCollum. Hello. And Dr. Victoria McCollum is a senior lecturer in cinematic arts at Ulster University and holds a PhD in horror studies. And Dr. Giuliana Monteverde is currently lecturing in communication at Ulster University and is a freelance writer and academic with a PhD in media studies. And yeah, they're both here to talk with us about all things kind of spooky and women and gender and horror and all that good stuff. So I'm going to kick it off and just say kind of why women in horror, because I think oftentimes people think of horror as very male audience genre, but there's so many women in the movies. There's so much that it says about gender. You know, why is it so interesting and why does it have so much to say about women particularly?
What a great question to kick things off.
It's a big one.
Juliana. I think that we spoke about this recently, Juliana, too. It's a really interesting question. Why are so many women in horror? It's probably not a question I've ever been asked before. And my mind immediately goes to that thing where living as a woman inside the wider power structure in society is itself to partake in horror. So I think off that, then we could assume or come to the conclusion that maybe women have a more intimate understanding of horror as a kind of emotional and aesthetic experience than their male peers. And maybe that's why women are attracted to the genre, why they star in the genre too.
Yeah, I also had to do a bit of reading for this question because, sort of off the top of my head, I wasn't initially sure. Yeah, I would agree with Victoria in the sense that women might have a different relationship to fear and also might be seen as sites of vulnerability and therefore more likely to be the subject of something that's about horror. But I also thought there might be more women on screen just because where there's death and violence on screen, there's women, you know, if you've got, especially like in slasher movies or torture horror, you've got obviously lots of violence and lots of sexual violence, and where we like to situate that violence tends to be on female bodies, both on screen and off. So perhaps that would be a reason as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as well, that's why people so often say, like, how can you be a woman and a fan of horror? As if it's something that doesn't quite fit.
Yes, as if it doesn't match the like purity of femininity or something, you know.
Yeah, because the main assumption is that the genre has misogynistic undertones, and it views its kind of the misconception, I guess, views it that, you know, female side characters are one-dimensional and all the rest, and I get that, but I think the thing that really shines through is that, like, leading women have always made waves through cinema for their complexity and their desire to survive. So actually it could be really inspirational as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but I guess my students were talking about this recently, and we came across a study that said that women talk more in the horror genre than any other genre. And they were like, well, why is that? I'm like, well, I don't know. What do you think? And we came up with the kind of idea that maybe horror deals with questions of sexuality and the body and gender much more than any other genre. And whilst it's kind of cliche to say, perhaps that's why women are given more of a leading role. Perhaps that's why people love to watch horror. Perhaps that's why, I know that was the reason why some of my women students really, really love the genre, because of films like Carrie and Ginger Snaps, you know, because it deals with that.
Yeah, and just thinking about Carrie and that whole like body horror thing, like it's very like rare to see something like menstruation, and same with Ginger Snaps, like in film, like it's just an odd thing to be in a film, full stop. Like it's basically only really in horror. But so it's nice as a woman, I think, to have those things represented, but they're often represented just in really like absolutely horrifying, like, terrifying ways. Like,
that's the whole point.
You know, and even I was saying to Giuliana, I was watching the The Exorcist recently, and you know, she's this cute little girl and she's going through puberty and she just goes absolutely insane. So I don't know whether you had any thoughts on, like, is it a positive thing that we have all this body horror, or like, can it be, you know, a good thing for women to have these things represented? Or, you know, sometimes I think Carrie in particular, it's a little bit schlocky and
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you, okay, Colette, say you are an up and coming actress, you're in LA, you're really desperate to get like a role that you can maximize your acting abilities. Would you rather have that kind of early role, hammer horror of you're attractive, you're white, and hammer horror would need you to be those things and curvaceous and all the rest, and your job is to stare doe-eyed into the eyes of some male protagonist who's coming along to save you? Or would you rather, you know, be Regan from The Exorcist and have this incredible performance? And of course, yeah, it's, you know, you would have to, I guess, I think what I'm trying to say is that horror of the 1960s, for example, often gets such a bad rep, because you have this shift and women no longer are just there to be saved by men. They actually become the kind of the monster. And of course that's caused by the sexual revolution, I think, as well. So women suddenly become pregnant in horror films. They give birth to demon children. Obviously it had a lot to do with the pill being approved at the time. But I think when you no longer are just there to play the victim and you now play the monster, well, as problematic as that is, actually there's a lot of agency in that. Like, I would want to play the monster, you know?
Yeah, I take like a kind of dual approach to the body horror thing as well, because on the one hand, I do think that it is like broadly positive in the way that you're describing. So like in its dealings with, say, excuse me, menstruation or birth, or, you know, all this stuff to do with kind of female bodies and kind of associations with women and with, say, like reproduction or with the earth, or, you know, those kind of like very traditional notions of femininity. I do think that they can be problematic sometimes, because they are like, it essentializes this idea of what it is to be a woman. And if you always depict women as, you know, people that give birth, or, you know, people that menstruate, it's quite a, like, it restricts the notion of what a woman is to kind of anatomy, which I think we've moved past in other regards. But then also it can do really fun and exciting things with that. The movies I've been thinking about were Jennifer's Body, you know, where the body is very explicitly, you know, it's in the name of the movie. And it's a very politicized body. It's a body that understands that it's sexualized and then uses that, you know, to kind of conquer other bodies, which is great. And then in something like Midsommar, I think that it subverts the kind of the monstrous female body, because it really shows reverence for like female experience, and for it being communal, and for this kind of movement away from individuality into like this space. So she's kind of giving over her body to the whole. So I think it can work in different ways, but I think we have to be careful about tying women too closely to the body or a certain type of body.
Yeah, 100%. It's really insightful, G. Yeah, definitely. And I think that no wonder great waves of feminist criticism came at the time and kind of,
yeah,
you know, assumed that the genre was, that hetero men were the kind of chief consumers of horror. And it's no wonder it was accused of misogyny. It should have been in many ways. But I think that this has had a lasting impact in horror, and it hurts horror. And I think that women are very much seen as complicit. That's why, you know, people look shocked when women are kind of willing to pay for a movie ticket to watch their own vulnerability and watch their own assault and violence inflicted on their own kind, you know, in a way. But I think the point is that for me, and maybe it's to brush off, like maybe when I say this, I'm kind of erasing a lot of the problems with it, but women often are three-dimensional characters with backstories and wants and needs and desires in horror, particularly contemporary horror. And I really like that example of Midsommar, Giuliana. It's a film I hated. I hate it.
Why? I love it so much. I
don't know. I find it so deeply unpleasant. I was almost walking out of the cinema, and maybe
Why?
I haven't had time to give it enough thought. But
let's discuss that. That's wild.
But yeah, I think that with the final girl thing, I think by the 90s, then women were these relatable soul survivors, and that can be empowering, because who doesn't want to watch someone go kind of toe to toe with their aggressor? I think that's really, but yeah, totally, it's problematic, but isn't everything, and aren't the most delightful texts difficult, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting, that notion of like the horror's thought of for, you know, male audiences, because I think Jennifer's Body really suffered from that, because it was marketed by its own studio, you know, as for boys, which to me is the most bizarre. Like, it was described as like Twilight for boys.
Oh God, yeah, that's.
Like, I don't get that at all. And so then Megan Fox was framed in these kind of very sexual terms, which she already had been because of Transformers, which kind of like then precluded the film from being read, you know, in a feminist way.
Yeah.
Just sort of, oh, a hot cheerleader eats boys, you know.
Yeah, it's pathetic. I think though that's just, it's the power of that long-standing conception or misconception that horror films are made by men for men, and who indulge their, you know, sadistic, aggressive, voyeuristic fantasies against women. I was like, of course, not all men, but yeah, it's just that thing. It's, I think the concept of Final Girl brushes that all against the grain. And yeah, we're still going to have those kind of lingering close-ups on the female body as she showers, you know, before she kind of goes after the killer. I think that's kind of really problematic too. But I think more and more people are kind of, I mean, I know, it's speaking to my filmmakers, I was speaking to them on Friday in class, and they were saying, you know, how do we, they always ask me these questions I don't know the bloody answer to. It's like, well, how do we not do the male gaze thing? Like, well, let's talk about some ways that we might not do that, you know? So it's just really, really, really difficult to unpick some of these things, because no matter who we are, we kind of are complicit in so many ways. You know, I was trying to explain to them, it's not just about how men look at women, it's about how women look at women and how women see themselves, and
definitely
really complex.
I do wonder if the final girl thing, you know, she makes it to the end, that's to be admired, but like, is that a male view of like the kind of virtuous woman? Do you know? Like, she's plucky and bright and she's made it to the end, you know. Like, I think I have a quote here from Carol Clover, who came up with the term, who said it was an agreed upon fiction for male viewers. So like, yeah, I wonder if that like brushes up against that at all, or is it still, I mean, to me it still seems worth celebrating that it tends to be women that like, you know.
It's worth celebrating quietly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm always kind of looking at the history of horror, and I'm like, well, that is better than kind of playing some silent sexualized scream vamp. But like, then you're like, well, is it? You know, but yeah, I think that it's, you know, any role that you're not there just to be looked at is a good thing. Do you know, that sounds so depressing, but
low bar, like, yeah,
the world we live in. Do you know what I mean? And I think that the horror genre is the most powerful avenue for young actresses to cut their teeth. I think that's brilliant for that, but with that comes so many problems.
I was looking at something ages ago about like true crime and stuff, and like all the podcasts and stuff are so big now, and it's like huge majority of women enjoy like those documentaries about serial killers and podcasts and stuff. And it's, I mean, I guess people don't really know why, but some people say maybe it's like they're looking for like a how-to guide on like how to survive in their own lives. So maybe that's part of the enjoyment of particularly slashers and stuff for women, of like, you know, could I survive? Like, how would I, you know, even though it's a, you know, overblown kind of scenario.
Yeah, I think it could be like an avenue for exploring that type of fear in a controlled environment, you know.
I was going to say Giuliana is one of the best people I've ever spoke to about why people watch these, as my dad would say, hatefully dreadfuls on TV, the kind of true crime stuff. Do you have any thoughts on that? I remember we talked about this before, you know, why women are kind of drawn towards true crime, or am I imagining that conversation happened?
I don't remember the exact conversation, but yeah, I presume it is to do with that relationship with fear and the social positioning. And like, yeah, whilst it mightn't be explicit, kind of like, you know, how do I avoid getting murdered? It's,
yeah, absolutely.
It might be more kind of useful resonant material for women
Yeah.
is for others. I don't know if there's like maybe some link with morbidity, or with like having to engage with unpleasant things just because of harassment and abuse and all the things that women kind of as a broad social group have to face.
I think you're on the money too.
Yeah, I would think that it's exploring something that's kind of dark within parameters that you're going to be guided around. You can go and look up information afterwards. It's a more ordered way, I think, of dealing with maybe anxieties that you have about moving around in the world, maybe.
Absolutely. I think it never really has to do with people's obsession with serial killers, that's for sure. Do you know when people yeah, absolutely. Interesting.
This is just like my personal view. Like, I find it very difficult to watch. Like, I don't particularly like the slasher genre or torture stuff in horror. But I love it in like real stuff. And I almost, in my own mind, I'm kind of like, I don't like watching like fake torture and stuff like that, because I feel like, oh, it does actually happen to real people. And if that happened to me, I'd like there to be a documentary. Like, I feel like I'm almost like memorializing the woman that it happened to by like learning about the story of it.
Yes, it seems less gratuitous if it's kind of.
Absolutely.
Even though it could be worse, it could be like really, I mean, there's so many documentaries now of like John Benet Ramsey, just like, why do we have that? Like some of them are really gratuitous and like icky, but yeah, that's I don't think that makes any moral or ethical sense, but that's just in my mind how I approach it. I don't like fake stuff. I only watch like the real stuff when it's very.
Yeah, I would almost be similar to that. I feel like it's almost a waste of emotional response.
That's it. Yeah, you go through so much like pain or something. You're like
for something that doesn't exist, yes. Whereas you could like properly engage with actual tragedy.
But yeah, maybe it's some kind of stimulation fatigue where you're like, I'm not going to waste my, like I was watching Halloween Kills, the new Halloween film the other night, and I was sitting thinking, this is so gratuitous. Like, there's barely a narrative here. It's just a bunch of gratuitous clips strung together. And just because he's attacking a gay couple, like this gay male couple, I'm like, well, that's different, but does it actually? No, there's nothing new here. There's nothing original here. And yeah, I think that you just think, why am I wasting my time on this? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would much more for horror movies like prefer the kind of like villainous woman, or at least the kind of half and half victim revenge narrative. Like, I find much more fun because it is draining to just watch people be killed over a long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends how much emotional investment I guess you put in, but some of us are more kind of prone to that, I guess.
It depends on the genre. Like, I don't want to waste emotion over what I guess I sometimes see is like, yeah, I guess I'm not particularly into slasher, and I'm sure that there are misconceptions that I'm attaching to it, but like in something like Midsommar, which is amazing, yeah, I have a different response. Like, I obviously don't mind kind of having emotional response or engagement with that, because it seems like the character is more 3D, I guess, and like worth spending my time feeling about. Whereas when they're just kind of, women that kind of just get tortured and die, that's changes my approach,
Yeah, that's not interesting. When women just, that sounds like a terrible film. But it is kind of a reflection of so many. I think I enjoy slashers just for nostalgia reasons as well. I think it's a lot to do with nostalgia for me, but yeah, no, I get it. I get what you're saying.
And what about, women kind of behind the camera? Like, how does that change things? And I mean, there's always been women making horror and writing horror, and especially like back in the day writing horror, like stories and stuff. But now we're seeing more female directors specifically. How do you think that changes things, or does it change things for representation of women on screen in horror?
Well, I think that women have always been behind the camera. Deborah Hill co-wrote Halloween, produced The Fog and 30 other films. Mary Lambert directed Pet Sematary, the highest grossing horror film directed by women. I think it's these people have been erased, so we assume that they were never really there. Suspiria was co-wrote by a woman. Mary Harron directed American Psycho. I think it's really problematic. You have this thing. I think that film criticism is overly male. It's a male-dominated field. Like every time you log on to Rotten Tomatoes, 73% of the top film critics on there are male, and men are seen as kind of cinema's leading tastemakers. So many hardworking, talented women of the past have become erased from recorded history, partly because film criticism and film history is a boys' club. But on the one hand, you have this. So in the film industry, women often have to embrace these macho genres in order to be taken seriously. So if I was a woman coming up in the industry right now, I would be looking at making a horror film or a war film. But then you're also going to be lambasted. So Giuliana kind of brought up Jennifer's Body, which was directed by Karen Kusuma. And obviously that was a kind of satire of how women's bodies are objectified in society. So she set out to make a feminist horror film that the critics read as a sexploitation film. And she was absolutely pillared for it because critics felt that Megan Fox was too sexy. And yet this was a satire and they were too kind of dim to read it. But it's because of the assumption that horror can't actually address gender politics. And then Kusuma actually went on to make The Destroyer, which critics panned again because it featured this career-defining performance by Nicole Kidman, and she played this hard-boiled detective. And Kusuma was criticized because she was too ugly. Critics said that they couldn't even face the look at her, and you're like, Jesus, either way, it's a kind of lose-lose situation. So I think that things are changing and women have always been there, but yet you will face tons of criticism. But no matter the criticism you face, like Catherine Bigelow when she won the Oscar, because she didn't kind of frame it in gender terms and speak about women, because she didn't feature a lot of women in her war film, she was criticized. But either way, this kind of nonsense gets people talking about women's filmmaking, gets people talking about gender, about genre, about feminism. So yeah, that's what I would say. No matter the criticism, no matter how difficult it is for women in this industry, every single thing they do kind of creates a wave and gets a kind of scholarly and critical interest in time.
Which I think is unfair because it obviously places an unreasonable standard, because there's few, then that means that Jennifer's Body kind of becomes this like stand-in for all, female or feminist horror cinema, for like a really, really long time. And then, yeah, like you say, there's kind of hyper scrutiny, and also whether someone's art kind of properly serves their community or their identity, rather than, that's not a standard that we place on men, or, they're just allowed to make things. I was super interested in I'd only seen Jennifer's Body literally this week for the first time, and I read a lot about it.
Yeah.
And I was surprised by that weird gap between what the movie is and how it was received. And then also how I had imagined it to be over years of kind of hearing it and seeing iconography and music and various stuff to do with it. I think I assumed like a sort of high school, she kills boys, the structure of it, the way that it opened, and it's overall kind of like hyper stylized, Juno-esque, very camp, much more camp than I thought. Yeah, like it makes it very clearly a satire.
Yeah.
And despite like the credentials, the feminist credentials of having a female writer and director at that time, and a sort of female-centered horror story with a female monster villain, it was still received incorrectly. Like that annoys me so much. That, like, as you say, you're doing everything that you're kind of supposed to do if you are going to, have to make art that represents your kind of identity group or whatever. And yes, still because of that broader cultural landscape, which was to do with reviews, like the reviews are so offensive.
Yeah.
That movie. And Megan Cross is entirely discredited based on her appearance. It's just a woman this attractive couldn't be doing anything other than just being attractive. It's wild. And she dealt with a lot of it around Transformers, and she kind of still is now. But even the kiss between the two lead actresses which is intimate and to me important in terms of like depicting their connection as opposed to their connection with the men in the movie.
Yeah.
You know, that was heavily in the marketing materials. Neither of the main actresses wanted to do it because they both felt that it was gratuitous, even though I argue that it isn't. But obviously the framing made them feel like the only reason women would kiss in this context would be to please a hypothetical male audience. So yeah, there's a whole lot that kind of went on there that it is massively frustrating and kind of illustrates, I assume, the situation for lots of female filmmakers, that their work is kind of taken heavily through a certain lens at the expense of the nuance of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still like Victoria, what you were saying, like women have always been there is so true, but it's still always kind of a bit of an event or a bit of something that you have to mention in a review if it is by a woman. And it's just like until we reach some kind of critical mass where it doesn't matter anymore, I think any woman directing anything just has to, like, someone's going to ask, is this feminist, even if they don't care about that whatsoever, you know.
Yeah,
it's just always kind of a little media piece, I think, even if it's not warranted in actually looking at the film and its actual themes and what it's about.
Yeah. I think it's because, you know, the old theory goes that cinema depicts the world and women from a masculine point of view. And, you know, that means, that this is why women are often framed as kind of being reluctant girlfriends, being dragged to the cinema and hiding their faces every scene, you know. And women represent a key market for horror films, just as they did in the 19th century for Gothic, you know, for Gothic and supernatural romance novels, you know.
Yeah, and completely. It is weird when you just don't see that female audience like ever kind of reflected back. And hopefully it is changing, I think, with some of like you mentioned, like Midsommar, like those films are a little bit more like supposed to be kind of artsy, so I think they are marketed towards more just women, men, whoever.
Also a male director, you know. Both Midsommar and Hereditary. To be fair, Ari Aster does it incredibly well.
Yeah, true.
It you know, in terms of representation or equality of diversity, it's still a male.
And this is it, like you don't have to be of any one group to represent, to just sort of take a little bit of time and represent them. I was reading about The Descent, I think it was the 2000s movie, like all the women going into the cave, which is like very scary. But the director is like a man, wanted to make a movie. He's like, oh yeah, there's never any movies with like women in them, so maybe we could just make one with a load of women in it. Like, is it like this is his new idea? But anyway, he made this movie and it's like all female cast, and he's like, how am I gonna like make this correct? You know, I'm a man, so he just like asked his female friends. He was like, I just asked my female friends how to make characters like three-dimensional, and they are, because it's, you know, you stay with all of them for that whole movies, they all end up having like different personalities and stuff, so like it's not impossible to do.
Yeah,
you know.
actually the guy that played Christian in Midsommar, the boyfriend, he apparently advocated for the full frontal nudity for his own character because he hadn't seen it, you know, because nudity is so often used to denote female vulnerability, especially in horror. He advocated for that because it was, you know, it wasn't seen before, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool, too. I like that. I think that it goes without saying that, like, you know, men can make smart and scary films too, with empowering female characters and feminist undertones. I'm thinking about Lucky McKee, you know, filmmaker, and, you know, so can women. I think The Invitation, again, Karen Kusuma, reveals that, you know, women are so extraordinarily well equipped to dissect masculinity in the world of men too. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and even going like beyond gender, like there's so much has been written about like horror as like queer themes in horror, and I know we talked about a bit about slashers and stuff, and some of them can be a bit dodgy from that point of view, but like I'm thinking like Psycho and stuff is quite like, there's all people dressing up, on Texas Chainsaw you have like men dressing up as women and killing people, and but there's also like just really so much fun stuff. Owner, could either of you talk to any of those kind of themes in horror?
Your question just brought to mind that demon J.K. Rowling and her suspense novel. I think it's like Troubled Blood, and it's about this cis male serial killer who dresses up as a woman to commit murder. You know, it's just like,
that's
what a prime example of like toxic sludge. You know, it's terrible. But I think that, you know, someone like that is obviously kind of just dim enough not to know. I mean, I think those stories existed for a time because, you know, cinematic queer people were pushed underground and they were relegated to like existing only in the subtext, you know, back in the day, and most often as villains, because that was the only way they could kind of express their sexuality visibly and blatantly, was through the kind of monstrous queer or like this predatory character. So there exists a reason why that kind of trope came about. But like not now, that's ridiculous now, you know, it's just ugh. But I think that one of the things that ensured that the queer monster stayed around was that kind of conservative political wave after the AIDS crisis. But I think now queer characters are beginning to exist as like actual protagonists in the stories, instead of being relegated to just being an outcast or a demon or some kind of sexual deviant. You know, queer characters now have friends and social structures, and I think that's really cool. But like no queer kind of horror film conversation can happen without The Craft, I think. And The Craft is feels like such a queer film to me, and yet it's not explicitly queer in any way.
I haven't seen The Craft in so long, but I only
must watch it.
Yeah.
One of my favorites. I think it's like responsible for awakening so many teenagers' first sexual stirrings. You know, it's just such an amazing film.
Yeah, I guess was kind of thinking about Hereditary in terms of this subject. I don't know if you've seen it. It's I hadn't actually read it as a kind of trans allegory whenever I watched it, which maybe means I kind of missed a significant part of the subtext. But yeah, that in a movie like Hereditary, I guess that, yeah, queerness isn't treated as deviant, even though it's a kind of supernatural demon that is queer in this context. But it's just sort of, it like reflects the trans experience in a way that isn't moralizing on it, I guess. And I don't mean the trans experience, obviously, in relation to being decapitated and, you know, being a demon, but rather the kind of sense of like the lack of belonging at the start of the movie, the kind of alienation from their body that Charlie feels. I think they actually express at the start that they want to be a boy. And so then the violence kind of acts as like freeing them.
Yeah.
You know, rather than kind of rooting them in the body, which can be the case otherwise. So yeah, I mean, also, of course, I was thinking about Jennifer's body because that is my main touch point for this conversation. And likewise, like I already mentioned, I think it's a shame that the kind of queer subtext in that movie was just written off as like for attention or something, rather than as like a valid expression of the feelings of the characters, you know. But again, I see that as an issue with the kind of broader culture in which that movie was released rather than the movie itself necessarily.
Yeah, very true, very true. I think there's I watched a really cool vampire film recently called Bit, and it's about this teenager. She's called Laurel. She moves to Los Angeles after graduating high school to kind of make this fresh start after transitioning, and it was really, really cool. Also, they just announced that it's the actress from the L Word, Jamie Clayton, I think she's going to be the new Hellraiser. Like Pinhead, and Hellraiser is iconic camp horror film, and I think that's like a creative masterstroke really to make that casting decision, because Hellraiser has always kind of portrayed sexuality as far more open and fluid than the usual conservative kind of trope of promiscuous straight teenagers getting killed. For any kind of indulgence. And it's, yeah, I think that like that casting it's going to be amazing. I think that could change things.
I presume that the kind of themes that can be explored in horror, you know, like we said with women before, it applies in the same way to sexuality, you know, in the sense that horror is a space that deals with things that might be taboo, or, you know, kind of relationships or ways of being, I guess, that are outside the mainstream. And so then horror provides a good place for that to kind of be explored, obviously in some cases in a troubling manner, but in other cases in a more kind of progressive manner. So I presume it's to do with like the conventions of the genre, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think that kind of, for me, it reminds me about like race in the horror film, because I think there's this kind of assumption, but that I think there's when you're dealing with a kind of character or figure that there's so much historical pain associated with, there's this assumption that you can't make stories about them and have present pain. It's just this,
yeah.
There's this thing, obviously the film industry has a serious race problem. Like white actors are even cast in non-white roles. I mean, it's insane. Thinking about Prince of Persia for some reason that comes to mind, but and only white people would be arrogant enough to stay in a house that has a ghost.
Gods of Egypt, I believe, was another one.
Okay, yeah. You know, so white people, I think, will always be in those narratives where people are slightly dimmer and stay in the house whenever there's a demon there. But yeah, I think that, you know, I've kind of heard that argument, well, don't, like, a horror filmmaker, I can't even remember who it was, said, well, don't Black people have enough problems? And of course, we want to see the well-fed middle class be subject to the bogeyman in horror film. Like, that's kind of pleasurable. But it's an interesting one. I was watching, because race is a horror story, you know, the body cam footage of Black Death tells us that. And maybe that makes that.
Sorry, they changed the end of Get Out for that exact reason, actually, because
Oh, okay.
Jordan Peele, it was too much trauma.
Yeah, so there is that thing, because I was watching The Sixth Sense the other night. Have you seen that film? And it's set in Philly, and we all know that Philly is predominantly Black. And I think, well, what would have happened if that little guy Cole was a Black boy, and then would he have seen Black Ghost? And then, like, when the audience see a Black ghost, would they assume that Black ghost is a slave because of the historical pain that comes with that? So it just opens up this kind of complexities, I think. But, you know, honestly, I've just written that book called Bloody Women Directors of Horror, just edited it, sorry. And one of the things that surprised me the most was a chapter by Ashley Blackwell, and it was arguing, you know, that Black female directors are coming to the fore in horror, and they're incorporating their voices within a space that's overwhelmingly white and adding texture and kind of giving voice to the Black experience. And I think that that's going to be really exciting, you know, really, really exciting. Did you guys see the new Candyman?
No,
I
but
haven't seen it, but looks good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Read the stuff around it. I believe there was lots of people calling it Jordan Peele's movie, right?
Yeah, even though it was directed by Nia DaCosta.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of that sort of stuff was going on around it, but no, that's all I saw. Which again then just means that she has to deal with higher levels of scrutiny. I think you can release the man and you can market it as you would without then producing a small cottage industry of like bloggers and writers, you know, all kind of debating whether it like stands up to, you know, whatever kind of impossible political standard is put onto it.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy the film, but yeah, I think that the pressure for her is kind of just astronomical, really, when you think of Peele's attachment. But there's there's a few, like Nia DaCosta's one, Maddie Depop is another kind of French Senegal Black director, and she actually was the first Black female director to compete for the Palme d'Or for Atlantics, and it's about, you know, a supernatural horror drama kind of rooted in real world social commentary, and it's, you know, now these characters are fully developed Black women characters that aren't kind of constantly undervalued in cinematic text and painted as sinister Black women. It's really interesting. And then Blumhouse Productions recently have kind of optioned a film with Dee Rees, so another Black American filmmaker, a woman who made Pariah, you might have seen. and it's about Black rural lesbians who reside in this haunted house, and that's kind of cool too, you know. So I think there's a lot of positivity coming to the fore. I think we can be really optimistic about it.
Yeah, and I think you're completely right, Victoria, about, you know, if you're looking for a really lovely presentation of whatever you are, like, horror is not the place for it, but it's still important. Like, it's a bit off topic, but I was reading something about the X-Files, and obviously X-Files, like, you know, from the 90s, and it's two white characters, and they're in the, like, northwest of America for the whole thing. And they talked to the directors and writers and stuff, talked about, like, oh, we want to, like, you know, it goes on for like 7 or 10 seasons. Like, we want to make it a bit more diverse. Like, we want to go into other cultures and other backgrounds and stuff in it. But because it's about weird stuff going on, it's very difficult. That they were like, oh, it's very difficult to be like, oh, we're going to do an episode in like the Chinatown community in San Francisco. Yeah. It's very difficult to not make those people like the other, because that's what the show is about. So there are all those issues, and I think like having people, writers, directors, actors, like just having a whole mix of different perspectives, so that it isn't like always this, you know, you're not always the villain. It's good to be the villain too if you're never the villain, you know. It's good. I think like that's the thing, like women sometimes are drawn to horror because they're like, well, at least I can see a woman even if she's being killed. Like, at least it's a woman, you know what I mean? Like, it's enjoyable to see yourself on screen, even if you're just taking like the scraps, so to say. So yeah, it's just, I think horror is just so interesting from that, and I think it can just easily be like problematic, like but like it's such an interesting genre in that, you know, it's never really depicting purity. It's a bit boring, you know, if you have like really black and white. I think like the most interesting characters are those ones that are kind of villains and victims at the same time.
Yeah, and monsters and the marginalized will always be linked, you know, because monsters share a similar status within our kind of patriarchal structures of seeing. They're there to be looked at, they're there to be othered, they're there to be punished, they're there to be victimized. And yeah, I think that there's always going to be a kind of problematic link between the two.
And it was nice, actually, Giuliana, you mentioned like Get Out, and that kind of was a little cheeky, you know, the white woman in it is a kind of the traditional victim, but she's actually probably like the most evil person in the movie. So that was kind of a fun.
I think that's really important. It's important in terms of intersectionality, because like you can obviously talk about women in horror, but we're quite often talking about white women, let's be honest, as said, Victoria. So I think it's important that character, that character is a villain in lots of women of color's lives, right? Like the kind of white woman that has social power, you know, she is a villain, and she might be painted as like innocent or passive, you know, to other parts of society, but to people of color, white women, you know, there's a really well recorded history of complicity with white supremacy. You just have to look at the votes for Trump from white women, and you can see that there. So I do think that is super important in terms of kind of race and gender, having that, you know, it's not just the kind of patriarch of the family that has his kind of, you know, old-fashioned views on slavery and race, but it's also the younger, you know, more culturally resident, more culturally proximate figure that is able to like entrap, you know, their targets as well, because of that. The social perception of white women as always being fragile and vulnerable and, you know, innocent.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's like the beauty of horror. It's you can just take any kind of social issue and that you can't really deal with, maybe we're not ready to deal with in a drama. Maybe people don't want to sit there and watch a whole drama about something that they're experiencing every day in their life, but it can be quite a relief to see it turned up to 11 in a kind of monstrous thing, and it can be kind of almost like a comic relief and cathartic to deal with those things.
Sorry about that.
Did your desk fall down?
Yeah, something just fell, but yeah, sorry about that, folks.
I think myself at the same time.
It actually scared the life out of me. I don't know if it was because we were kind of talking about these things. I think that's the kind of last thing I'll say, I was thinking about this recently, like what is the pandemic horror going to be like? And obviously you could assume it's going to be that like internet technology is going to make a return and be the monster, you know, webcams and Zoom. But I think that horror is becoming, interestingly, I mean, really good horror films, they have this like anti-capitalist streak, in the vein of kind of Romero's Dawn of the Dead or Carpenter's They Live. Realize I've just mentioned two guys. Anywho, and post-pandemic horror seems to, I think it will have this central trope of kind of eat the rich, you know, because it's holding up a mirror to kind of rampant capitalism and racism and, you know, just the kind of slaughterhouse of corporate rule that rules our society right now.
That is so brutal. Like,
but it's the truth.
Slaughterhouse of corporate rule. Wow.
Yeah, and they like suggest that the imagined diseases of the marginalized in society are kind of the key engine of middle class preservation. You know, I think things are going to change. It's an interesting time. I was going to say it's an interesting time to be alive. No, it's not. But yeah.
Yeah, let's live in less interesting times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta, like, we're actually at a time, it feels like we've only been talking for 10 minutes, but for my last question, I just want to do a fun one and just ask you, like, what your favorite female character in horror is, if you have any faves.
Mine is super incredibly obvious, having listened to this conversation. It's Jennifer Jack. Like, I mean, I'm a big fan of Megan Fox. I feel like she's underrated in general, and like people assume that her attractiveness precludes her abilities, which I don't think is true. And I like that she's just a very unabashed hypersexual character that is monstrous. I loved watching her.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Time I was like, eat him, you know. It's not like, it's that viewpoint I don't normally get as a woman, I guess. And also, just while I'm talking about it, the song I Eat Boys by Chloe Moriando is really excellent. It's based on Jennifer's body, and the video is just a wee teenager now going about murdering people. It's really
and you shared that with me recently, Giuliana. I've never really seen anything like it. That was cool.
I adore it because it's a very like the music doesn't match the content, you know. It sounds like a very sweet sort of acoustic pop song, and it is very specifically about eating people. So yeah, for me, Jennifer Check, just for the fun of it all, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yours might be cooler than mine. I think I really like Tiffany Valentine Ray from the Child's Play franchise, you know, Tilly, the Jennifer Tilly. So she's this kind of gay adorned star of stage and screen, you know, and I think that she speaks with this trademark like childlike cadence. And what I really like about her is I think that she came off this career high of having this Oscar nomination for a Woody Allen film, and then she made this kind of groundbreaking lesbian film called Bound, and then she opted for the Child's Play franchise. And like, what a path, you know. I love that she jumped to the franchise, and it had such an uphill battle for respectability, and you have to admire someone that's willing to like surf that wave. And I think because of her, Chucky has kind of went from this like slasher villain to an LGBT icon, because Tilly had such an impact on the film. But I have to say, if Viola Davis was to star in a horror film, she would probably take over as my favorite. I think she is the most unbelievably talented human. I'm just so taken with her right now. She's unreal.
Nice. What's yours, Colleen?
I was gonna go with
Colette, sorry. Don't know why.
I was gonna go with Tippi Hedren from The Birds. Even though she's not like super feminist or anything. I like the glamour, I like the blonde, and I just like that she's very, people are kind of criticized like Hitchcock about this, that she's very like empty and kind of icy, and like she's being attacked, but she's very kind of chill about the whole movie, and just kind of calm and collected, and I kind of just appreciate that in like the midst of all this chaos. She's kind of like but yeah, I really like that she doesn't give a very like extreme performance in that movie, and I just love her, and I love that movie. Birds.
Yeah, and as well, why can't women be empty and icy?
Yeah, I like it. It was like refreshing, like change of pace. But yeah, and yeah, I love that movie. And yeah, my wife's actually afraid of birds, so she's never seen it and she never will. She's actually genuinely afraid of it. So, but yeah, any final thoughts?
I'm going
Anything
to
you wanted
end
to
on
say?
a final thought that happened on Friday with my students in editing class, and they're such a lovely bunch. And we were talking about like how we could rail against stereotypes in films, and they made a rule now that all of their coursework that comes in their film productions, that men are going to be short and women are going to be hairy. And I just thought that was just the coolest thing. Really quite simplistic, but has a real impact. So I'm looking forward to receiving that coursework.
Love that.
Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah, it's cool.
I think you've just solved the problem of sexism
Like,
in
so
horror.
much. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I
Like-
think so.
Oh my God. Well, thank you both again. This has been amazing. Yeah, Giuliana and Victoria, thank you so much, and have a very safe and spooky Halloween season.
It's been awesome.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, guys.
Bye.